Chinedu Okonkwo was a 22-year-old university student living in Surulere, Lagos. Tall and lean, with a quiet demeanor that made him seem older than he was, he carried the weight of his family's dysfunction on his shoulders. The Okonkwo household was a small bungalow tucked away in a bustling neighborhood, its walls echoing with unspoken tensions and simmering resentments. Chinedu's father, Emeka, was a retired police officer, a man hardened by years of service and haunted by his own demons. His strictness was legendary, his temper a ticking time bomb. He ruled the house with an iron fist, his voice a constant thunderstorm. "You'll never amount to anything," he would shout at Chinedu, his words sharp and cutting. "You're just like your mother, weak, useless." Nneka, Chinedu's mother, was the opposite. Gentle and kind, she worked as a teacher at a local primary school, her days spent nurturing children while her nights were consumed by the thankless task of keeping peace at home. She loved Chinedu deeply, often whispering to him, "You're my only joy." But her love was tinged with fear of Emeka's rage, fear of his fists, fear of what he might do if she ever dared to defy him. One evening, as Chinedu sat in his room studying, he overheard his parents arguing. Emeka's voice boomed through the thin walls. "You think I don't know what you've been doing? You're nothing without me." Nneka's response was soft, pleading. "Emeka, please. I haven't done anything wrong." Chinedu clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He had heard these arguments before, but this time felt different. This time, he heard something in his mother's voice, a quiet desperation that made his stomach churn. He wanted to burst into the room, to stand between them, but he knew it would only make things worse. Instead, he sat frozen, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Emeka's anger became more frequent, more volatile. One night, after a particularly brutal argument, Chinedu found his mother in the kitchen, her face streaked with tears. She was clutching a bruise on her arm, her hands trembling. "Mama," Chinedu whispered, his voice breaking. "What happened?" Nneka shook her head, her eyes filled with shame. "It's nothing, my son. Just go to bed." But Chinedu couldn't let it go. He lay awake that night, his mind racing. He thought about his father's words, his mother's tears, the way the house felt like a prison. He thought about the stories he had heard of women who disappeared, their bodies found in ditches, their husbands never held accountable. He thought about his mother's face, her fear, her helplessness. And then, a thought crept into his mind, a dark, terrible thought that he couldn't shake. What if he just disappeared? The next day, Chinedu couldn't focus on his studies. His mind kept drifting back to the idea that had taken root in his thoughts. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't stop himself. He had to protect his mother. He had to do something. That night, he sat at his desk, his laptop open. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he typed, "How to kill someone without getting caught." His heart raced as he read about poisons, their effects, and how to administer them. He felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by a grim determination. The next day, he went to a small chemist shop in the market. The shop was dimly lit, the shelves cluttered with bottles and jars. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a bored expression, didn't ask any questions as Chinedu handed over the money for a small vial of rat poison. His hands shook as he pocketed the vial, his mind racing with what he was about to do. Dinner that night was a tense affair. Emeka sat at the head of the table, his face dark and brooding. Nneka served the food quietly, her hands trembling as she placed a bowl of bitterleaf soup in front of her husband. Chinedu watched as his father took the first bite, his heart pounding in his chest. "This soup is too salty," Emeka grumbled, pushing the bowl away. "Can't you do anything right?" Nneka flinched but said nothing. Chinedu's fists clenched beneath the table. He had put the poison in his father's food earlier, and now he just had to wait. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, Emeka clutched his chest, his face twisted in pain. "What's happening?" he gasped, his voice strained. Nneka screamed, rushing to his side. Emeka, what's wrong?" Chinedu sat frozen, his mind racing. He had done it. He had actually done it. But instead of relief, all he felt was a cold, creeping dread. His father's lifeless eyes seemed to stare right through him, accusing him, condemning him. The days after Emeka's death were a blur. The police came, asking questions, but Chinedu stuck to his story. "It was a heart attack," he said, his voice steady. He had high blood pressure. Nneka didn't say much. She spent most of her time praying, her whispers filling the house. "God, forgive us," she would say, over and over. But Chinedu couldn't sleep. Every night, he saw his father's face, heard his voice. "You did this. You killed me." One evening, Nneka came into Chinedu's room. She held a small piece of paper, a receipt from the chemist shop. "Chinedu," she said, her voice shaking, "what is this?" Chinedu froze. "It's nothing," he said quickly. "Just something for school." But Nneka wasn't fooled. She looked at him, tears in her eyes. "What have you done?" Chinedu broke down. "I did it for you, Mama," he sobbed. "I couldn't let him hurt you anymore." Nneka sank to her knees, clutching the receipt. "Oh, Chinedu," she whispered. "What have we done?" The police came the next day. They found the poison in Emeka's body, and the receipt was proof. As they took Chinedu away, Nneka stood in the doorway, her face pale. "I'm sorry, Mama," Chinedu said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to protect you." But she didn't answer. She just watched as they led her son away. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Chinedu sat in the defendant's dock, his hands cuffed, his face pale. He avoided eye contact with the crowd, his gaze fixed on the floor. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, heavier than the chains around his wrists. Nneka sat in the front row, her face drawn and weary. She clutched a rosary in her hands, her lips moving in silent prayer. Her eyes were red from crying, but she held her head high, determined to be there for her son. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman with a steely gaze, stood to address the court. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cold and precise, "the defendant, Chinedu Okonkwo, deliberately and maliciously poisoned his father, Emeka Okonkwo, with the intent to kill. This was not an act of self-defense or passion. It was premeditated murder." She held up the receipt from the chemist's shop, the small piece of paper that had sealed Chinedu's fate. "This is the evidence that proves his guilt. He purchased rat poison, knowing full well what it would do. He mixed it into his father's food and watched as he died. This is not the act of a grieving son. This is the act of a cold-blooded killer." Chinedu's lawyer, a young man with a tired expression, rose to his feet. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "my client acted out of desperation. He was trying to protect his mother from years of abuse at the hands of his father. Emeka Okonkwo was a violent man, and Chinedu saw no other way to save his mother. This is not a case of cold-blooded murder. This is a tragedy born out of fear and helplessness." The judge, an elderly man with a stern face, listened intently. He glanced at Chinedu, then at Nneka, before turning back to the lawyers. "Proceed," he said. The prosecutor called witnesses, neighbors who had heard the arguments, the chemist who had sold Chinedu the poison, the doctor who had confirmed the cause of death. Each testimony chipped away at Chinedu's defense, painting him as a calculating murderer. When it was his turn, Chinedu's lawyer called Nneka to the stand. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she took the oath. "Mrs. Okonkwo," the lawyer began gently, "can you tell the court about your husband's behavior?" Nneka's voice was soft, barely audible. "He was angry," she said. "Always angry. He would shout, throw things, sometimes. Sometimes he would hit me." She glanced at Chinedu, her eyes filled with tears. "My son. He was trying to protect me. He didn't want me to get hurt anymore." The prosecutor stood up, her voice sharp. "Mrs. Okonkwo, did you ever report your husband's abuse to the authorities?" Nneka shook her head. "No, I was afraid. He was a police officer. Who would believe me?" The prosecutor's lips curled into a thin smile. "So instead of seeking help, your son decided to take matters into his own hands. Is that correct?" Nneka didn't answer. She just looked down, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. After hours of deliberation, the judge returned to the courtroom. The room fell silent as he read the verdict. "Chinedu Okonkwo," he began, his voice heavy with gravity, "you have been found guilty of murder. While the court acknowledges the difficult circumstances of your home life, the law cannot condone vigilante justice. You took a life, and for that, you must face the consequences." Chinedu's heart sank. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a punch to the gut. He glanced at his mother, who was crying openly now, her hands clutching the rosary. However, the judge continued, "Given the mitigating circumstances, the court sentences you to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10. The gavel came down, the sound echoing through the courtroom. Chinedu was led away, his head bowed, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He had thought he was saving his mother, but all he had done was destroy their family. In prison, Chinedu had time to think. He thought about his father, his mother, and what he had done. He realized how wrong he was. He thought he was saving his mother, but he had only made things worse. One day, Nneka visited him. She looked older, her hair streaked with gray. "I forgive you, Chinedu," she said softly. "But I can't understand why you did it." Chinedu lowered his head, tears streaming down his face. "I don't understand either, Mama," he whispered. "I don't understand." As Nneka left the prison, the heavy gates clanged shut behind her, echoing like the final note of a tragic song. Chinedu sat alone in his cell, the silence pressing in around him. For the first time, he didn't fight it. He just let it be.